Great. I hope you've been learning a lot of Python and having fun learning. And in this session, we'll be learning about functions. And there is a assignment right after this, a sort of a homework that I really recommend you to go about trying it. Great. So let's come back. In this session, we're going to talk about functions. Like I said, what are functions? We've been talking so much about it, methods and functions, and what is all this we're doing. Functions, if you're coming from a different language, it's fairly simple. And they are one of the main building blocks when we construct a lot of amount of code. Let's define function formally. It's something that it sort of groups everything together. It could be a group of statements together, it could be a group of operations together, and it could be run more than once within a program. And they also let us specify parameters that can serve as inputs to functions. So for me to process somebody's salary, I have written a function that does some sort of computation and tells me how much tax I have to pay, for example. Then the input could be the salary, right? I need to pass that value into my function. On a more fundamental level, functions allow us not to have repeatedly write the code. So if I have to process the function for one employee, I mean process the salary for one employee, I have a certain operations to perform. But what if I have 1,000 employees? Let's say I have 10,000 employees. Now how do I handle that? So I don't need to write this operation again and again in my code, but I write a function. So if you remember back on the lessons and strings and lists, remember we used a function called length to get the length of a string, because checking the length of a sequence is a common task. You want to write a function, and that can do this repeatedly at command at the time whenever you want it to be done. So that's where functions, and they become a very basic building block of reusing code in Python. And reusing code is another design feature of Python, so that you're not repeating yourself. And it will also allow you to start thinking about programming design, which we will dive a lot deeper into ideas of design, which is very important when we learn about object-oriented programming and object-oriented design. Now let's see how to build out a function syntax in Python, and let's get started with a piece of code and see in our hands-on. To begin with, let's keep it very simple and build on, add more complexity, and like we always do. All right, over to my screen now. Great. Let's see how to write a function first. So function needs to be defined first. So we have a keyword for that. It's defined, pretty obvious, right? And then we have a name of function, and that's something you put, and then we put an argument 1, and then maybe an argument 2, maybe more, it depends. And then you have some sort of code. I'm going to put 3 ticks here. This is called a tick, or you can also do something like this. And this is a place where you write your functions document string. We'll get to this in a bit. And then after that, you sort of define what you do here and return something, or return a result. That's what pretty much it does. So we begin with the def and a space followed by the name of the function, and then we try to keep the names relevant. For example, length is a good example for the length function, right? So instead of calling len, right, for example, instead of calling it length, we call it len. So we sort of keep the name relevant, and also you have to be really careful that there are some built-in function names. I cannot create another function with the same name of a function that is already built in Python. So I cannot create a def len because this is already a function. So here is a link that I'm giving it to you so that you can reference this link, and always be sure that you're not using a function or naming a function with the same name as what is already built in Python. You will run into trouble if you do so. Nothing worse will happen. Your program will just not run the way you want it. That's about it. Then we have a pair of parentheses with a number of arguments separated by a comma, and these arguments are inputs for your function. You'll be able to use these inputs in your function and reference them. After this, you put a colon. Then now here is an important step, right? You need to indent to begin the code inside your function currently. If you miss that indent, if you miss this tab, so everything after the function should be on the same line as this, not everything, but pretty much the next line. And if you miss this, then your function will not be running correctly. So Python makes use of this white space to organize your code. A lot of other programming languages may not do this. So if you're coming from another language, you think that's flexibility, so that you can type anything at any line, but that's not flexibility, that's making code unreadable. So much so has gone into Python. If it's easier to type and easier to understand, it should also be easier to read. I know it might be harder to program, that's a whole different argument to have separately. I'd be happy to catch up with you on that another time, but it's so important that we indent, make it readable all the time, and Python swears by it, and it's at the core of it. Now, what is this doc string I mentioned at the top? This is the doc string I was referring to. This is where you write a basic description of the function. So this is another really cool thing of Python. It lets you tell people, let's say you've written a program, it's got about 6,000–7,000 lines, and then you have several hundred functions, and you don't, someone else takes over, or you have to move on, you got promoted and you need to do something else, and someone else has to work on, you need to hand off your code to that person. How would you go over 300 functions that you've written a year ago? So this simplifies this. It's not exactly for that, but again, readability is at the core of it. So there is a doc string, and that comes across a function. Every time you press Shift Tab after a function name, you'll be able to see or read these doc strings. They're not necessary for simple functions, but it's a really good practice to put them in, so you or other people, like I said, be able to read this. And after all this, you can begin writing the code that you want to implement. Now, what's the best way to learn functions? Well, there is no simple easy route. It's through examples. It's through trying to go through examples and relate back to various other objects and data structures we learned before. We may not be able to try a function, or there's never an end to writing functions for all different types. But let's go over some examples we humanly can. I'm going to write a simple function. Okay, so it says this one. The job of this function is to say hello every time this is run, and it just executes this. Okay, and I will put this 6 again, and says this just says hello all the time, or make it more relevant, hello every time it's called. Okay, now that we have the function written, we need to call the function. What do you mean by calling a function? It's just nothing. You just have to type this function and run this, and it says hello. And I'm going to write another function which will be the greeting. Let's call it a greeting, and I want to this time address the name of that person, name of person. Okay, and I would say print. Okay, print. In this, I would say hello. I will talk about this modulo s in a bit, and then there is a modulo name of person. Right. So that means this function takes an argument and then says hello, and then passes or returns that argument, right? So it's not exactly the return call, but we can officially say so. And greeting, it says I'm going to call, as usual, we're going to call upon James Bond. Now notice that I haven't defined a type of argument that it should take. Normally we do, but let's say I run this, it says hello and James Bond. If I say greeting and say 1.4, it would also still take that, because we haven't really handled it. We look at handling exceptions and so on later on. I was talking about return statement, right? So let's see some examples that use a return statement. What exactly is a return statement? Return allows a function to return a result that can be stored as a variable or used in whatever manner a user wants. Let's create a function that adds numbers. Okay, so I'm going to create a function that adds numbers. Okay, so it takes, of course, I cannot add with only one number. I will need two numbers to add, right? And I want it to return a value which will be addition or sum of num1 and number2. That's all return does. Now, if I say adds numbers and I pass on something, okay, something like this, and this adds it up, or let's keep it more simple, adds numbers 1 and 2, and this returns 1 plus 2 is 3. That's what it returns. And you can also save a variable due to a return. I can also say result of that add number. So, result is a new variable I am creating, and then I can, because I know what it returns will be a number, I can just run it like this, right? And then I print, okay, adds numbers. So, I print result. I can do it either this, or I can also do this inside of the parenthesis, and this prints 4 plus 3 is 7. Now, what happens if we put two strings? Here we saw I put number, it worked. You're talking about numbers and all that, and you have num1, num2. What exactly happens if I put strings? So, it's simple. I say print, and I say adds numbers, and in this case I'm going to say string, let's say I'll add 6 with 7. So, a trick question, what will be the output? 6 plus 7 is 13, right? It should output 13. Is that correct? And if you think so, it will be 13. No, it's wrong. You've got it wrong. So, it's a string we're passing. So, Python does not know you're talking about numbers. So, oops, I have done something. I have made a grave mistake. What have we done here? So, I used print, right, and it says adds numbers. So, something I have done is incorrect. So, it says invalid syntax because it does not accept that we are adding a or I can, if print is confusing you, if is what is happening, it adds it like this. So, you cannot do print and this, but you can definitely do this, and it's added it as if they are numbers. So, Python is still there. We don't declare variable types in Python. If you are in other language, you would say variable integer a is equal to, is equal to 4. You go about defining this sort of a thing in other languages, but in Python we don't declare variable types in Python. This function can be used to add numbers or sequences together. So, that is how Python understands. So, it did not add a string, it added a set of sequences because it did not get numbers or integers. So, we will later learn about adding in checks to make sure a user puts in the correct arguments in our errors and exception handling. But for now, I hope you are getting what I am trying to say with respect to functions. Let us also start using break, continue, pass and other elements in our code we introduced during the while loops lecture, and then we go over creating a function as an exercise, so that it helps us to check whether a number is prime or not. So, let us try that exercise. It's a great idea. Let us try and see if we can write a function that tells us whether a number is prime or not. All right. So, how do you know what's a prime number? If you're heavily into mathematics, you would know it straight away. But for those like me who are not really math savvy, I don't know if that word really exists, but for those who really are not, mathematics is not their strength, you can Google. But since I've done this many times, I know a prime number is the one that is divisible by the same number. So, for example, and there is no other number that can divide a 7, correct? So, 7 can be divided only by 7, it is a prime number. So, a number is called prime if that number is only evenly divisible by 1 and itself. So, let us try to use this understanding and then be able to write a function. Okay? Let us begin with creating a function and check for prime is let us say check prime, and it will take a number, all right, and then I will say a very beginner method of checking for primes. I will put this, and after that I will use the for loop for every number in range. Okay, be with me on this. You will know as I type the code. For every number whose division, when they are divided by this number by itself and is not equal to 0, print. So, that is what the function, right. So, if it is divisible by itself, only then it will be 0, and I am taking the same number and trying to divide it, and it will say not, this is not a prime number, all right, and it will break after that, else print prime. So, this is if it is not 0, if it is not equal to 0, then it is a prime number. You have got a prime. Okay, let us see this function in action. So, I am going to say check prime, and let us say I put some number. This is not a prime number because when it tries to take that number and tries to divide it by 2, and the result is not 0. So, what happens if I check prime 11? You have got a prime. It's printing because it's trying to divide it many times, but that's fine. We can handle this later on. What if I put for 7? So, you've got prime, and it prints 3 times because it continuously checks and iterates. So, note how we break the code after the print statement when it's not a prime number, and how it prints continuously when it's not. And also we can disregard all the even numbers after checking for 2, and we'll also switch to return a Boolean value to get an example of using return statements. Let's try to make it much more robust this time. I will import a library this time. We'll talk about libraries later on, but math is a library built in to perform mathematical operations, like there are mathematical methods. So, this is a library is a set of functions, and it's got a lot of functions and methods inbuilt, and we're going to use one of them. I'll be sure to leave a trail of where you can actually watch this, read about all the math functions that is there, and then I'm going to use the same function that I have. So, check for prime, and this time will take a number like last time, and then let's call this is a better method for checking primes. Okay. So, let's see how that works. Well, you might say you're using the same method. Yeah, I need to still check whether it's evenly divisible by 2, and there are no remainders, and I want to add a Boolean telling that whether that number is greater than 2. If either of it would return only when 2 of them are true. So, otherwise it will return false. Okay. And then for every value element in my range, this time range starts from let us say 3, and I will be handling this with this time by specifying an integer math dot square root. This is a method. So, I do a math dot and hit shift tab. It gives me whatever I have and how this actually works. So, I am going to use a method from library called square root number, then I can add a plus 1 and 2. Okay. Now, if that number is modulo I is not equal is equal to x is equal to 0, then return false, and if nothing happens, return true, and this should be at the end of it, right? So let's see what happens if this is a function, and I will call this function. Okay, check for prime, and we'll try the same number again. It's this time it's false. This is not a prime number, correct? And I will try to put another number, let's say, and it gives me an error. So you cannot multiply sequence of non-integer type. So I will look forward for you to resolve this, and you can let me know what is wrong in my code here. If you're able to pick this up, that's great. I'll pause for a while and see if you can answer this. So great. So what is a problem here is that it is considering that there is a number that is, well, it passes all the way. So this part of the code is correct. It's returning a false, but only after I write this here, that's where the problem is. So I'll try to let you guys solve this, and please watch out for a solution in the assignment. I'll leave this as it is, and please go about. If you understood this, you would solve it. Otherwise, please feel free to search. Great. Now you should have a basic understanding of how to create your own functions to save yourself from repeatedly writing code. Let's move on to understand some more core concepts in terms of object-oriented programming in Python. See you there.